Hi again guys, and welcome to episode 12 of Spirit of Le Mans, the review series where I'm evaluating the pros and cons of each purpose-built prototype on Gran Turismo 6. So in this episode, as you can see, we're going to be featuring one of the most popular prototypes of recent years, the Peugeot 905 Evo 1. Now this car is significantly lighter than pretty much all of the other prototypes. It has a Formula 1 derived engine, which means it has insane revs, insane power, not necessarily so much torque, but big power, big revs, and very, very lightweight. Without its rear wing, it's actually a surprisingly small car, kind of like the BMW V12 LMR. That's also quite a small car, which lends itself to having sharp handling. As we said, the weight is extremely low. It only weighs 750 kilos. Which is almost 100 kilos lighter than the Mazda 787B. Red lines are over 11,000 RPM, and it actually won the 1992 and 1993 Le Mans. So that's it for our intro. Now let's go first of all to our city track and start our review of this car. Now, as we just said, the 905 is quite a small car. It's just the rear wing that makes it look bigger than it actually is. Very small, very light, and it has a Formula 1 derived engine, as we said, so you're probably expecting it to be a pretty good city car. And it is. Now the acceleration isn't quite as quick as some of the other prototypes, so straight off the bat I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5 for acceleration. But for low speed handling, maybe not surprisingly, I'm going to give it a strong 5, because it is very, very good. For brakes, which obviously are also very important on city tracks, I'm also going to give it a 5 out of 5 because the brakes are excellent. But considering how little weight they have to stop, it's not that surprising that the brakes are good. Now overall on city tracks, I'm going to give this car a rating of 5 out of 5 because it's perfect for it. Short wheelbase, low weight, rev happy engine with not too much torque. And having low torque does reduce the amount of wheel spin that your car is prone to. So for city tracks, it is very, very good. The handling's nice and nimble, the brakes are sharp, the acceleration is good, and overall it's just a very, very good car. So that's it for our city track. Now let's go over to our moderate speed technical track at Ascari. Now the surprising thing about the 905 is that unlike most of the other prototypes where the handling generally remains pretty predictable, so if they have a certain characteristic at low speeds, it's usually carried on to their higher speeds. But with the 905 that doesn't happen, because on city tracks the handling is fairly loose, not exactly twitchy, but very sharp, to the point, and that's why it's so good. But on moderate speed tracks, that actually completely changes, because the handling is no longer sharp and slightly twitchy. The handling actually becomes the opposite. It becomes heavier than you'd expect. And that's actually a good thing, because it equates into smoother steering. It also has more grip than most of the other prototypes of its power, which means that the cornering speed and the stability and the confidence you have in the car are much, much greater than most of the other prototypes, especially ones with this kind of power. So overall, for mid-range handling, again, it's a strong 5. I'd say even a stronger 5 than it achieved on a city track. And overall, for moderate speed tracks, again, I'm going to give it a strong 5 out of 5 because it is very, very good on them. For overall drivability also, I'm going to give it a strong 5 because it's pretty easy to drive, surprisingly easy to drive actually, and it will serve you extremely well. I mean, there's a good reason why this car is so popular. So that's it for our moderate speed test track. Now let's finally go to our high speed track. Now, those handling characteristics that we just mentioned that come into play more on a moderate speed test track, that slight heaviness to the steering but massive, massive amounts of grip, actually carry over to high-speed tracks as well, or at least to Spa anyway. And it makes the car able to do something which is of a really good advantage for a prototype, and that is it can punch well above its weight. Its power and its top speed, on paper, it shouldn't be that good for high-speed tracks, because there are plenty of prototypes with better top speeds and with far more power and way, way more torque. And yet, the 905 is among the quickest cars of all the prototypes around Spa, despite it being such a high-speed track. And the reason for that is because of how much grip it has. Now, as I've said before, all prototypes can wheel spin, but the 905 is capable of taking corners and exiting corners with much more throttle applied without wheel spinning than any of the other prototypes, by far. Which is surprising considering how light it is. You'd think that a car with well over 1,000 horsepower that weighs only 750 kilos is surely going to be wheel spinning all the time. But it actually doesn't. It's amazingly good for grip. So overall, for high-speed tracks, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. Because although, as I just said, it is good for this track, on other high-speed tracks with much, much longer straights like Lasarte, it can still fall behind. So that's it for our actual testing. So now let's go back to the garage for the roundup. So overall, the 905 is an extremely strong prototype. It's brilliant at pretty much everything it does. It's not perfect. None of the prototypes are perfect. But for many people, I think they would say that the 905 is their favourite prototype of them all. The 905 and the 787B are pretty much the two, from what I've seen anyway, the two most popular prototypes. And for good reason. They're actually very similar. Very low weight, low torque, high power and high revving, with sharp handling and good brakes, with an inclination more towards acceleration rather than top speed. But of the two, I would say that the 905 is a stronger all-round contender. The handling is excellent, the grip is phenomenal, especially considering its low weight. The top speed, although not class-leading, is pretty good. The acceleration, again, not class-leading, but very good. Overall, the best point about the 905 is definitely the amount of grip that it has. It allows you to enter, but especially exit corners much, much quicker and with much more confidence than with most of the other extremely high-powered prototypes. Most of them, if you give it a full throttle or even more than half throttle, you will enter a rampant wheel spin. With the 905, that just doesn't happen. Obviously, as I said before, all prototypes can wheel spin, and with the 905 you tend to wheel spin when you're exiting corners at, say, 50 miles per hour or less. But for anything above that, the grip is, it's phenomenal. It's got an amazing amount of grip, and this is coming from someone who doesn't even particularly like the car. I'm not a huge fan of the 905. I can understand why people are, because it is a good car. I just don't personally like it all that much. Its weakest point, I would say, probably its straight line performance, because although it's definitely not slow, it's not as quick as some of the other cars of its type. It's the top speed, well, not just top speed, but the overall straight line performance isn't quite as good as cars, for instance, like the Toyota GT1. And it's really that stops this car from being perfect, because if that straight line performance was better, it pretty much would be the best prototype of them all. But I'm sure there are many people who probably think it's the best prototype of them all anyway, and obviously you're entitled to your opinion. But overall, if you haven't tried this car, I think most of you guys probably have, but if you haven't, I would strongly recommend that you do so, because it is very, very good. And as usual, I'll be putting all the ratings and lap times that this car achieved in the description, so you compare it to the other prototypes if you need to. And as always, Thanks for watching.